everyone, I'm Catherine Barona with Level Set. I work with lawyers in our lawyer community to host these webinars weekly and bring you such great attorneys such as Joe Katz of Katz Law. He's based in the Baltimore, Washington metro area. And I will let Joe get started now and introduce himself, give you a little background, and get started with his presentation. Thank you. And if you have any questions at all, please write them in the chat box in Zoom or the Q&A panel in Zoom, and we'll be happy to get Joe to answer those questions for you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for tuning in on a Thursday afternoon. Change orders are, I've kind of something I tell clients are change orders. You can't live with them, you can't live without them, and that's because subcontractors have very different perspective towards change orders. Some people plan for them or submit their proposal planning for change orders and are giddy when change orders come through, and others absolutely, it's the bane of their existence, and there's nothing that they hate more than having to deal with change orders. My perspective is kind of in the middle. Not, their change orders are simply a matter of business, a matter of doing business, cost of doing business in a sense. And the better we're able to be prepared for change orders, the better we're able to anticipate our change orders, price our change orders completely as early as possible, and get them signed, or otherwise stop work until they're signed, then they can stay as change orders and not become claims down the road. Because what happens with unpaid, unapproved change orders is that they pile up, and at the end of the job, you're looking at a very large claim, which perhaps you're filing a mechanics lien for, a payment bond claim, or you just got this large REA in a government claim situation, request for equitable adjustment. And in the law of collections, there's a rule that says the something that's not paid within the first 30 or 45 days, the chances of collecting it go way down exponentially with the amount of time it's outstanding. I think there's something similar in missing persons, right? Isn't the show 48 Hours all about, those first 48 hours of a missing persons file are the most crucial, because 48 hours comes and goes and there isn't a substantial lead, and the chances of finding that person alive and well, unfortunately, go down. So change orders are similar in the sense that if you haven't grabbed the bull by the horns and really addressed a change order before you do the work, the change work, or at minimum in the early stages of starting to do that work, the likelihood that you're going to get paid for that in a timely fashion really goes down, and then it becomes a claim towards the end of the job. I'm going to present here these three modules. I've got an overview, and then pricing of a change order fully and completely is very important. And then I've got, I think it's about 4 or 5 roadblocks or tips that I've found over the years representing contractors and subcontractors are really, really crucial points when dealing with change orders. What is a change order? According to RS Means, change order is a written authorization provided to a contractor approving a change from the original plans, specifications, or other contract documents, as well as a change in cost. This will also include a change in time, which is an important aspect of construction. We've got, time is money. So the longer it goes on for the contractor, the more money it's going to cost. And the longer it goes on for the owner, the more of a cost to the owner, a loss in use, is likely going to occur, which could become a back charge if we haven't crossed our T's and dotted our I's, both in terms of the increased cost and the increased time. Make sure we get change orders increasing our time. Why are change orders issued? Well, change orders are usually, for the most part, either adding work, subtracting work, or changing the work. Instead of the bathroom on the left, the bathroom on the right. Instead of adding a floor, subtracting a floor. You wouldn't be surprised how common it is that floors to buildings get added or subtracted already once it's under contract. Now, there are less common sources for change orders, which include gap in scope, either because the owner or the general contractor just failed to tee up all the work, and mid-construction, suddenly everybody's looking around, who's doing the grouting? Well, nobody's under contract for the grouting, so most likely is the contractor, either the trade contractor, either just prior or just after that trade work, is going to be asked to issue a change order and do that missing scope. Instructions on means and methods. The very definition of a contractor, of an independent contractor, is control over the means and methods of the work. If you're being controlled, if you're being told the means and methods by which to do your work, you're an employee. You're not an independent contractor. Now, it happens fairly often that an owner or a GC actually says, sees a trade doing something one way and says, no, don't do it this way. Don't do it that way. Do it this way, the way I want it done, the way the owner wants it done. And that's ripe for a change if it causes an increase to the cost or an increase to the time of the trade subcontractor's work. So instructions, and similarly, a sole source instruction, don't use Carrier, use some other brand, or vice versa. If there's an increase in cost or time, that's ripe for a change order. And of course, relative to the time factor, we've got delay, acceleration, and overtime. What drives a change order? Design errors, probably number one. Get in there and the plan is wrong. Could be slightly wrong, could be majorly wrong, but usually there's a change to the work that needs to be done, which leads to a change in the cost. Differing site or project conditions, whether it's a renovation and it's what's behind the walls that nobody knew beforehand, or even in new construction, we've got groundwater, we've got unsuitable soils, incomplete drawings at the time of the bid. Many large government, U.S. government contracts, projects, and state projects will actually not have 100% for construction drawings at the time of bid. Right, the solicitation of government contracts and the award of government contracts is often driven by the end of the fiscal year, and whether the agency has money left over, they want to spend it, because once the fiscal year comes, they lose that allocation and the money's taken away. So very often, projects will be put out to bid without a completely 100% for construction drawings prepared, because the agency just wants the money awarded so that they don't lose it at the end of the fiscal year. And what this means is that there most certainly will be changes because the drawings are not complete. And crucially, everybody knows that. Everybody, all the stakeholders, the owner, the GC, they all know that, and they're anticipating it and they're waiting for it. So there's no reason in the world the subcontractor, the trade contractor, shouldn't also keep their eyes out for change orders and exercise that right to change orders. to get an idea of how often there are change orders, what this table shows is, if you look at those two highest ones, the 30% within the 6 to 10% range, and 41% within 11 to 15%. This tells us that over 70% of contracts, of projects, have changes between 5 and 15% value of the job. $1 million job, 70% of those $1 million projects are going to have change orders between $50,000 and $150,000. And for a trade contractor, that would mean you can well expect that between 5 to 15% of your own scope of your price will be subject to change orders. It's an increase usually in change orders.
Hey, Joe, we do have
Sure.
one question.
Sure.
First question is from Mark, asks, is means and methods inclusive of an approved safety plan?
Well, that's an excellent question. Safety is often, 2 or 3 pages of a subcontract that details the safety requirements. So means and method is, I would say no. I would say safety is really, for the most part, probably spelled out in the subcontract. So there's a requirement to keep to the letter of the subcontract, whatever it says regarding safety, and because safety is really paramount and also governed by OSHA and corresponding state agencies, an instruction as to safety would usually not be a means and method. But if you deem that safety requirement to be over and above the requirements of the already agreed requirements of the subcontract, or over and beyond the state law regulation, then sure, then that's an instruction to do something different than the laws that you've agreed to abide by in the subcontract, and you should apply for a change order for that. So it's kind of a combination there.
Okay.
Is there anything else?
Oh, there is one other question from
Sure.
Lynn. What are the consequences for the contractor if they do not notify how much extra time a change order will add to the project?
So you might get your change order, your $5,000-$10,000 change order. But if you've got a liquidated damages provision that says $1,000 a day for every day you're late, and you're 30 days late because of that, you're going to be given back $30,000 in liquidated damages if you didn't also negotiate an extension of time. And even if you don't have liquidated damages, if you're late, then the general contractor or the owner, if you're a GC, can still seek common law damages on account of your being late. So if you're late, and therefore if it's student housing and they couldn't get the students in there by September when they were arriving, they could lose a whole semester, a whole year's worth. They could argue they've lost a whole year's worth of rents that they want you to pay for. So it's crucial when you figure out the amount of money. At the end of the day, every change, there's no reason in the world a change order should be submitted without a time increase. If you're asking for more money because there's more work, you're also entitled to more days to do this more work. So definitely throw in, whether it's 10 days, your change order form should have a already pre-filled 5-day or a 10-day minimum of extra time that's requested, and that should be, obviously, the bigger the change, the more time should be requested. This table demonstrates that, with the exception of mechanical, you can see very often the distribution of change orders among trades is fairly static, within 10 to 20% for structural, electrical, and finishes. They're going to be seeing between 10 to 20% changes. In mechanical, statistically has by far the most changes. Often that's duct runs, interferences with duct runs, loads in terms of cooling and conditioning the airspace. But the point is that everybody, all trades, this applies. The change orders apply to all trades pretty much equally.
Okay, we have one other question right now.
Sure.
It is from Edward. He asks, it's kind of a long one. I don't know if you can see the chat box, but I'll just read it off, and if you want to reread it. Can the GC or the owner legally force a subcontractor to perform work prior to approval of a change order due to time-sensitive work? And in the past, the AIA had a document called Construction Change Directive, which directed the GC or subs to proceed with work and discuss the cost of the change at a later date.
Excellent question, and that is essentially the subject of the final 10 minutes or so. So hold that thought. Let's kind of do this in order. Let's kind of go through the pricing. What I'm trying to do here is demonstrate that change orders are absolutely totally expected, fair game, fair play in the construction industry. There's no reason in the world to be hesitant about identifying and submitting change orders. We've got to price them correctly so that they actually serve you and don't cost you. And then we're going to talk about all the defenses or the walls that GCs throw up. But that's all they are, roadblocks. And we're going to discuss some workarounds. I am trying to, Catherine, I know you told me I could go over a little bit. I'm going to try as much as possible to stick to the 1:30 end time, because I know people have scheduled things around that. But we may, I suppose anybody that's interested can stay on for 5 to 7 minutes if it's to discuss those roadblocks a little more.
Yeah, and I just want to let everyone watching out there know that you will receive the recording of this in your email in a few days, maybe early next week. But please stay on with us for now, and if you can, just keep your questions coming or at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so what this table shows, and I don't make this stuff up. This is researched data. Really from all over the world. This one, the earlier study I know was a Norwegian study. I don't know specifically where this one came from, but I believe it's also internationally based. 50% of all change orders are fixed price negotiations. Beyond that, then you get into static pricing methodologies, usually because either the unit price is stated in the bid or actually in the subcontract, or it's an adjusted unit price, or it's simply a cost plus, right? The actual cost plus a pre-identified margin for profit and overhead, usually somewhere between 5 and 10%. Those are the minority, right? The majority, what this table shows us is that most change orders are negotiated at a fixed price. The subcontract will typically have negotiated as the best option, and if negotiation can't be achieved, if agreement can't be achieved, then either it goes to actual cost plus a margin, or it actually just becomes a claim, and at that point, you're forced to do the work, but you've got to kind of make a claim for it down the road. So when we're talking about pricing a change order, what is that comprised of? What is that price comprised of? There are the direct costs, which is the actual cost, the straight cost of the work that's added or changed, meaning the labor, the materials, and the equipment, or any subcontractor costs, if that becomes necessary. Those are straight costs. But if all you got were your straight costs back, you'd maybe be breaking even. Probably not, because there's a lot of hidden costs. The indirect costs, your field supervision, your salaried supervision is salaried to you, but not salaried to the GC. They should definitely be added to the extent any additional time is necessary. Then on account of the change, they should definitely be in there. The field overhead. This is often for a delay, and then extended main office overhead. That's what some people may know as the Eichle calculation, typically. Then you've got impact costs. Every change order should be evaluated for its overall impact to the project. This means that whereas the work itself, the cost of the work itself, we're being reimbursed for, we're not being unless we ask for it, unless we include it in there, we're not being reimbursed for the loss of efficiency, the loss of productivity. The actual change condition is doing more than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We can't just add in labor, materials, equipment, and have our price, because it slows down efficiency and productivity. And there are various different methods to calculate that. There's what's called a measured mile, which kind of measures if everything was optimal, what performance would be, and then in the current situation, what's the performance, and that factor is used to realize that recovery. And then don't forget any and all miscellaneous costs: fuel, lodging, tolls, bond. If you're increasing the contract price, then you also are supposed to be increasing the bond. You could put it in there, and if your bonding agent never asks you for it, he never asks you for it. Any legal fees associated with the change, additional insurance, etc. This is more, you want to track your costs. Ideally, a change order is negotiated and signed before the work is done. And if that's the case, if costs were more than you anticipated, unless you have a very good reason, you're going to own that. You're going to have to eat that. But regardless, cost tracking is important, because oftentimes your PCO will not be paid and it will become a claim at the end of the job. And if you haven't tracked the costs associated with this specific change, you're going to have a very hard time proving your entitlement, because at some point, job costs just become contract versus extra work. It becomes very difficult to, after the fact, separate which is which. Unit prices, right? If you haven't, if you're removing unsuitable soils, if you haven't tracked the cubic yardage of what you're removing on account of the unsuitables versus on account of the removed quantity in your subcontract, or if you're an electrician installing outlets and you're installing additional outlets, boring, whatever you're doing that's subject to a set measurement, whether number, or linear feet, or cubic yardage, if you haven't calculated how much is the change condition versus the contract condition, you're going to have a hard time getting paid for it. All right, so to summarize this section, the pricing section and the overview section, what I tell my clients is view anything that happens from a change order lens, meaning that not everything is necessarily a change order, but the question should be asked in every situation: is this appropriate for a change order? Can I, if something's going on that's affecting my efficiency, my productivity, my cost, my time, any effect, that anything different than the way this project was bid and anticipated to run, the question should be asked: can I extract a change order? And if so, then definitely do that. All right. Unfortunately, we just have a few minutes left, but I'll stay on probably till about 1:35 going through this. Each section was supposed to be about 10 minutes. Looks like I went over. Change order roadblocks, and more importantly, how to avoid them. The very first roadblock, or the very first difficulty a subcontractor runs into when dealing with a change order actually happened long before the change was recognized, and happened even before the subcontractor set foot on this project. It happened when the subcontract was signed. If you're not reviewing your subcontracts and carefully, not wholesale redlining them and sending it back with red marks on every page and cross-outs and additions, that has very little chance of being successful. GC normally just respond, this is take it or leave it. We don't make changes to our subcontracts. So it needs to be done with tact, and it needs to be done kind of on the thinking of the minimum changes necessary, but important changes that really do level the playing field. You've got to keep in mind that the general contractor has drafted the subcontract to protect itself as much as possible, and to really shift as much risk as possible to the general contractor onto the specific trade subcontractors. So instead of taking all that risk, push back a little bit. Think of an unmodified subcontract as an IED, an improvised explosive device, that famous scene from the Green Mile where he's standing there and he's got 3 IEDs all around him. These provisions of the subcontract were already set in place at the beginning of the job, and they're just really waiting to explode in your face at the right time, just like that IED. For example, I think this actually addresses the question that we were going to come back to. Many subcontracts will say, you've got to do the change order work even without any agreement on price. And even if we dispute that it's a change, you still have to do it. And we'll argue about it later, we'll fight about it later, but you've got to do the work. So, that is something that can be modified. At the end of the day, there are many subcontractors, many trade contractors out on that job, and there are many more, in a way, waiting in the wings, right? Because we see when a trade contractor leaves or is terminated, someone else is always found to come in and do the work. So it's absolutely not crazy to carve out in a subcontract that no, if we cannot reach mutual agreement on price, then we don't perform. I've done it and it's gotten through. So to answer the question is, you could be forced to do change order work even without agreement on price or without agreement that it's a change, if that's what your subcontract says. But if you've modified your subcontract so that you have the right to take or not take change order work if there is an agreement on price, then you're all the better for it. Something else to really watch out for is the typical subcontracts that GCs themselves draft and have subcontractors sign very clearly say, you do not perform work if you don't have a signed change order, and you will not be paid for changed work performed without a signed change order. And then you never hear that again on the job. It's always do the work, do the work, do the work. We'll figure out changes later. Do the work, do the work, do the work, without ever getting a signed change order. So hold their feet to the fire. Hold their feet to the language they themselves drafted and they themselves had you sign, and indicate that, I'm sorry, your own contract, my subcontract does not allow me to do the work if there isn't a signed change order, which typically it won't do. Now, there are options there. Some of the subcontracts will say, it could be done on force account, and we argue about it later, but make them do that, right? Rather than just do the work because you were verbally told to do the work and don't worry about it, we'll take care of you, without any writing saying do this work, on a forced account, or make them send that direction, do the work, so that at least down the road, there's going to be agreement, right? That a paper trail that you were forced to do this work. And then you can argue about what the cost is and whether it's a change order or not. But if you don't even have an agreement, an instruction to do the work, then you're not as well off. Okay, so marking up a subcontract is crucially important. You want to be able to, like we discussed, have the right not to perform work if an agreement on price is not achieved. And here's something else. You want to, many times subcontractors are going to be working in situations of pay if paid or pay when paid. Payment to the trade subcontractor is dependent on the general contractor receiving payment from the owner. And because you've got mechanical lien rights and payment bond claims, that's not necessarily such a bad situation, as long as I tell all my clients, you have the right to stop work if you're not paid after 30 days, 45 days, 60 days maybe, and that's your control by which you're not working 6 months without getting paid. But you want to make sure that if you're doing a change, that's not dependent on the owner payment or not, particularly because the change might be a scope gap that the general contractor is responsible for. If you bid out, work A and C and didn't bid out B, then, that's his fault, and that he's not going to get paid by the owner specifically for that B work because it was never part of his own estimate. So why should you wait for the owner to not pay and then you yourself not be paid? All right, and then releases here, or you never want to sign a release that releases, even a partial release, that releases payment for all work done to the date of the release or the date of the last pay application, because many times you're going to have unapproved as yet change order work being done during that time, and if you're not paid by the end of the job and you try to get paid for those change orders, you could be sure the GC, or more often their lawyer, are going to be pulling out these monthly partial releases you signed and say, hey, month after month, you released us from all this money, so we're not going to pay it now. And that will be a defense to a mechanics lien. That will be a defense to a payment bond claim. Courts around the country routinely rule a release is a release is a release. A release is perhaps the strongest document a general contractor or surety can come up with to not pay a subcontractor. Have a construction lawyer review your contracts. That is an absolute requirement of construction these days. You've got to be careful about an overreaching scope. Many contracts will say you've got to do everything necessary, and if there's any kind of conflict between the drawings and the specs, the most strenuous, the strictest, most inclusive standard is what prevails. Here, I'm going to skip right to the bottom for time. Exclusions are your friend. Use them or lose them. You should know where you run into problems, where you become required to do things that you didn't think about, you weren't planning for at bid time. Rather than fight about it afterwards, make it an exclusion to your proposal and make sure that that is carried through to the subcontract. Very often, you'll give a proposal saying what your scope of work is, and then the subcontract will say your scope is all of this section, all of that section, all of the mechanical work, all of the electrical work, without regard to the exclusions of your proposal. So you've got to make sure when the scope of work, the scope of work document to the subcontract, you've got to review that super carefully and make sure that it matches your proposal. Either you've got to reference your proposal language or literally add in the exclusions from your proposal, because remember, your price was based on your inclusions and your exclusions. If the GC has now taken something else, that's not your price anymore. So this should be what your exclusions are. Should be a constantly, like a Google Doc. It should be alive in the sense that whenever you've got situations come up in projects, add that to your, for the future, for your next project. Make sure you don't make the same mistake twice. And after a few years, you should have a very robust set of exclusions that serve to protect you. All right, pass-through claims. Very often, this is usually for a government owner, there'll be a requirement to pass through the claim, or there'll be a right, rather, for the subcontractor to fight the owner directly through the pass-through mechanism. But the GC may well not pass that through, because why should he take on that headache if he's not really going to see much of it? So what you've got to do is you've got to hold their feet to the fire to pass that claim through. Meaning, when you identify the changes, the increased cost, the increased time, you've got to indicate that you are triggering your right to bring this as a pass-through. And this will then place the burden on the general contractor to do what he is supposed to do and actually pass that up and make the government address it. Oftentimes, they'll have to certify your claim. You've got to be careful. A lot of folks are nervous about certifying a claim, but to me, if you're telling the truth will set you free. You never have to be nervous about telling the truth. If you're not telling the truth, then you shouldn't be making the claim in the first place. Change order documentation, there's what I call the formal documentation and the informal. So if you're doing it, the informal universe includes RFIs, proposed change orders, notices, whether of the cost or the delay. But then you've also got a host of informal documentation in your toolbox, and that's email, text, photos, video. These are all tools that have to be used so that there's a real-time record of the fact that there was a change today, that the auger hit rock or whatever it was today, right? Not some point down the road. All right. So here's a situation of using email to your advantage. This is kind of just freehand draft of an email that says, we experience increased costs on account of obstructions in the duct run of building A. Roof trusses, catwalks, piping, other obstructions not shown on the drawings require continuous rerouting of the duct. And remember, it's a live situation, right? The very first time you reroute a duct, you don't know necessarily this is going to be a recurring problem. So you might decide to just swallow. You probably will just swallow it. You probably won't even know. The owner or the project executive or project manager may not even know about it. It might just be something that your workers do in the field, reroute it, put it in an elbow, and keep going. But at some point, there's going to be a realization that this is happening more and more often and is going to affect our bottom line. At that moment, there should be an email sent out immediately as soon as you've realized that this is going to be a situation where we're going to lose some money if we don't get paid for it. And then what you want to do. So here, he's attached. He says he's tracking time dedicated to the rerouting of the duct. He's attached a rate sheet, labor rates and equipment rates, and this will be applied to all future instances of rerouting. Meaning, he's also got to track instances of locations and instances of rerouting, and then crucially, that last sentence: if I do not hear back, we will have to stop hanging duct until this matter is resolved. Right? Don't just be an indentured servant to the GC, but exercise your right to pull back until it's resolved appropriately. You can think about a fixed in place camera, video, drone when a situation gets really out of hand.
Joe, real quick.
Sure.
We do have a couple of questions that were posted in the Q&A panel, so I just want to make sure that these two people that are still on, we get their questions answered and maybe go back to where you were.
Sure.
Sam says, we are a material supplier. Often a subcontractor will issue the original PO and then call and add more material and tell us to use the original PO. Are we protected on the original PO?
I mean, the short answer is no. If you don't have that, the purchase order increase, then there's not going to be an obligation necessarily to pay for more than what was agreed upon. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that a new PO or a formal amendment to the PO needs to be issued. Many times emails, believe it or not, emails are records or documents. They're electronic documents, but there's nothing that's not binding about an email, particularly when nowadays everybody's got these email signatures at the bottom of their emails. Many courts have specifically addressed, many states have statutes called electronic data or electronic records that say that electronic documents and electronic signatures have the same effect as blue ink signatures. And many state courts around the country have ruled that an email with offer acceptance functions as a binding contract. So the supplier should definitely make sure that this transaction for additional material and the cost that will be imposed is tracked in an email.
Okay, great. And the other from Lynn is the GC had to bring electric up to code, saying the building department said it was due to the way I wrote the scope of work. GC did electrical work without an electrical license and without permit. So the electricians are telling me they are responsible. GC is going to try to charge me for a change order that I have not signed or agreed to. Can the GC charge me for extra electrical charges without a signed change order?
Okay, so that's what we call in the industry a back charge, right? A change order typically is by agreement. A back charge is going to be when one is unilaterally charging back the other for work that they deem is the responsibility of the other. It's a little bit of an involved situation, but it just, the 10,000 foot view to me says, if you wrote the scope of work in a way that something wasn't included, what that means is that your price is for that scope. And if that's the agreed upon scope, then you're not responsible for it. You shouldn't be held responsible for additional cost because that wasn't in your scope, right? You should be held responsible for your scope at the agreed upon price. But if the scope is now increasing, is now something different, then I think you've got to be paid for that difference. So you can't stop the GC from issuing a back charge, but you can fight it in the sense of not agreeing to it and retaining the balance owed to you, and then chasing your remedies, whether it's mechanics liens, payment bonds, or a straight lawsuit. Releases, we spoke about how these partial releases are actually final releases through that date and time. So just like you wouldn't sign a final release at the end of the job if you're still owed money, don't sign a partial release if you're not being paid all the money that you've put onto that job yet, which includes unapproved change orders or pending change orders. And because you haven't been paid for your pending change orders, don't sign that partial release until you accept out unapproved change orders or pending change orders. And I have an exception here. This language, I think it's going to be available on my website. I suggest this, a rubber stamp. Nowadays, a lot of this stuff's done electronically, so you could just cut and paste this, but you stamp this on your release. Whatever that release says, this is kind of magic language, notwithstanding anything here into the contrary, which means whatever it says in here, I'm adding a clause to that says it's not going to apply to retention, unapproved and or unbilled change orders or any other extra work and work performed since the last billing cycle. Okay, now with the pandemic going on now for upwards of 6 months, some things you've got to think about. A force majeure clause, some contracts have them, some don't. Moving forward, everybody should have it, which says basically that if there's a national kind of emergency, which if you hurricane, tornadoes, if you're in those locations where those are often, those can be expected. Acts of God, terrorism, war, pandemic. That's a common situation that's called out in a force majeure clause. It says that you can get out of it because of that, and or you can be entitled to the increased costs. If your current contract doesn't have it, or if the GC is trying to get you to sign a subcontract that doesn't have a force majeure clause, make sure you get one in there. And particularly now, there's a labor shortage and there are increases in material costs. So very likely, if you have a force majeure clause, you want to make sure you're applying for, you're submitting PCOs for the increase in labor and the increase in material. And then any kind of, oftentimes, even if you don't have a force majeure clause, you're likely being subjected on current jobs to PPE requirements, to social distancing requirements. Maybe you've got to work, odd shifts to be, not have too much congestion on the job site. If these are mandates from the GC or from the owner, they are absolutely ripe for change orders. And what I end every presentation with to subcontractors is, remember your trump card, no pun intended. The mechanics lien, the payment bond option, those are your surest mechanisms, tools to getting paid in a timely fashion. And you don't have to wait until you do all the work. If there's an issue, if there's a change order that you're performing and you're not getting paid for it, file that mechanics lien. You can update it as the work increases. You can update it, file that bond claim. It will definitely flag attention to your situation from the highest executive levels on that job, and more likely than not, you will get paid. Thank you very much for tuning in and for sticking around, those that are still here. My website, joekatzlaw.com. Change order, and what it has on the screen there will provide some of the templates and a summary of what we talked about. And thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Levelset. Thank you to my assistant, Dylan Shane, for all his work in putting together this presentation.
Thank you so much, Joe, for your time and your presentation today. I know people did get a lot from this, and we had a few questions that you will receive this via email, a full recording of it, so you can go back and reference. And if you have any questions for Joe specifically, feel free to reach out to him and connect with him. And you can also post a question on Levelset's platform anytime. And we host webinars weekly, so please subscribe or sign up or follow Levelset wherever you are out in social. And we'll be sure to keep you informed of upcoming webinars if you just sign up. Thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe and have a great day.